Moving on with our solutions to the logical reasoning section of the free LawPrep, in today's video we will look at the first part of a very important component in the logical reasoning section. As I often say, a good test of knowing whether you've been able to comprehend something is to see whether you're able to make a correct inference on the basis of what you've studied. These inference-based questions form a major chunk of your LSAT India logical reasoning sections. Let us start with part 1.
So this question requires you to read the statements of the economist and then see as to what can be logically inferred from that. Okay, try it yourself and then we'll go for it together. And let me assure you that your knowledge of economics is of absolutely no use in being able to solve an LSAT India problem effectively. On the contrary, if you were to bring your knowledge of economics into this, you might even end up getting the question wrong. Remember that in an LSAT India problem, you are required to comprehend as to what is given to you and treat that material as the truth and proceed on the basis of the material that is given to you. Okay, let's go ahead and see this in some detail together. Right, so the economist says that our country cannot afford to bring its trade deficit down rapidly. If the trade deficit fell suddenly, the flow of foreign lending would similarly drop and there would be an immediate shortage of capital. In response, either inflation or interest rates would have to rise. If either rose, there would be a recession. So you can see that this follows a series of statements that appear to lead to something. Let's draw something like a diagram to understand this. It says that if the trade deficit were to fall, okay, if the trade deficit fell, then there would be a reduction in the flow of foreign lending. Now you see, I don't understand what trade deficit is. I don't understand what foreign lending is. So I just write it down as such, okay? And then it says that, and there would be an immediate shortage of capital, okay? And that leads to shortage of capital. In terms of economics, I don't know what that is. I'm just writing it down. And then it says, in response, either inflation or interest rates would have to rise. So it says in response, either inflation or interest would have to rise. And then it says if either of these rose, then there would be a recession. Okay. Now you can see here that there's a progression that is happening, and you also see here that a recession, or you can say even the trade deficit, is something that our country cannot afford. So that kind of looks like saying that the trade deficit or the recession is not good. Okay. Now, if you see the flow of the events that build this chain, it's very clear that this will ultimately lead to this. And if you look at the options, you can see the answer right there. So if you look at option E, it gives you exactly that. If the trade deficit falls suddenly, there will be a recession. What you had in between were a number of steps that we saw, but this is definitely what we can logically infer. Lengthy looking question. Okay, let's go for the question statement. It says, which one of the following is most strongly supported by the results of the studies described by the biologist? Now what that tells you is that in here the biologist is going to describe the results of some studies, and then you have to pick the option that is most strongly supported by the results of the studies that are described here. Pause the video, try solving the question yourself, and then we'll go for it together. So let us read what the biologist has to say. We'd seen that the question statement spoke about the results of studies, which means that there are going to be at least 2 studies in here. So here you can see that there's one study, and when you look through the passage you can see the second study here. Okay, you can see that it deals with the study of a particular species of frog. Okay, you can see that the second study also deals with the same species of the frog. Okay, now what does the first study tell you? The first study tells you that about half the frogs that lived in one region, okay, it talks about a certain region. If you look at the second study, it makes no mention of a region, okay, so you don't know whether it's the same region or not. Anyway, let's go ahead and read this. It says that half the frogs observed in one region inhabited temporary ponds, comma, shallow pools that frequently dry up after a few weeks. So this part here, which I'm highlighting for you now, this part that I'm highlighting here, shallow pools that frequently dry up after a few weeks, is basically just telling you as to what a temporary pond is, right? It's just telling you that. It says frogs inhabiting these ponds, which means frogs inhabiting temporary ponds, had a strong tendency to reach sexual maturity early, while frogs that did not live in temporary ponds had a strong tendency to reach sexual maturity late. Additionally, this study found that the vast majority of those frogs that excelled at avoiding predators reached sexual maturity late. So if there were frogs that avoided predators, that were good at avoiding predators, those frogs reached sexual maturity late. This is additional, okay, which means it's not really a part of the first finding. So you found the results. So we're looking at the results, right? The first result that we saw was from the first study. The result was that if the frogs that inhabit the temporary ponds reach sexual maturity early. Frogs that do not live in temporary ponds reach sexual maturity late. One more finding from the first study was that frogs that avoid predators reach sexual maturity late. So the three conclusions that you have: sexual maturity early, late, and late. Let's look at the second study. It says in a second study of the same species, it was observed, right, that several frogs observed in a single body of water all reached sexual maturity early. This is a lot of information to deal with. Let us see if we can simplify it for ourselves. Okay, as I said, you can see that one study, the first study, talks about one region, whereas the second study does not state if it is the same region. But both the studies deal with a particular species of frog, right? So what does the first study tell you? It tells you that around half of the frogs that were observed in the region live in temporary ponds and they reach maturity early. The ones that do not live there reach maturity late. It also tells you that many, like a vast majority, many of the frogs that effectively avoided predators reach sexual maturity late. Let's look at what the second study has to say. Now, the second study tells you that all the frogs in a certain water body reached sexual maturity early. Now, you have two studies before you, the first and the second, and you can find that there's a parallel at some point. The parallel is here. That the study number one talks about temporary and early, and here you can see early. You needn't so much bother about these here because they kind of talk about reaching sexual maturity late. So the kind of relationship between the first and the second is about here. Okay. Now I'd like to believe that the answer that we're looking for, the option we're looking for, will kind of indicate this connection that we saw between the two studies. Because obviously the biologist is talking about two studies and it's talking about the results of the studies, right? Which means that we're looking for something that relates to both the studies together. Can you pick the answer? Right, so when we're trying to relate the first study to the second study, the first point that we need to remember is that the region has to be the same, and in this case we really don't know, because you can see here that it talks about the same species but does not say same region. You don't see same region. So the first parallel that we need is that the region should be the same. The second thing is, what is the relationship between the two studies? The first study talks about early maturity in a certain case. The second study also has the result of early maturity. Okay. Now, early maturity here has happened in a certain water body. Okay. And early maturity here, according to the first study, happens in a temporary pond. So we are looking to find something that might relate these two and something that might give us this. Now, when you know this is what you're looking for, you can see that the option B is very readily the right answer. It says if the frogs in the second study were collected from the same region, then the frogs in the second study probably inhabited a temporary pond. So this was temporary, right? Let's move ahead and solve the next question. So I understand that right now you're watching a video, and if I tell you to pause the video and try solving the question by yourself, it might be something that you're not very inclined to do. Let me give you an alternative. Okay, instead of spending a lot of time trying to solve the question, I ask you to only spend 1 minute on the question. Now, what do you do in 1 minute? You spend the first 10 seconds or so just trying to see as to what is given in the passage here. So in 10 seconds, obviously, maybe you can just pick a couple of important keywords to get an idea of what this passage is about. Then you take 5 seconds or so to understand as to what this question statement is. Okay. And then really quickly, spending just about 10 seconds, again look through the options so that you kind of have an idea of what the options are about. Now, once you've done this, you're acquainted with the whole question in just 30 seconds. Now, in the remaining 30 seconds, go back, try to read this part, the passage once again, while keeping in mind what you saw in the question statement. Do at least that much, and then you can proceed to the solutions that we have together. If you feel motivated on this side of 1 minute, let's say you've spent 1 minute and you feel like spending a little bit more, then I'd say take 30 seconds and pick an answer from here. There's a big advantage of having picked an answer by your own self before you look at the solutions. That advantage is that you know as to what you don't know in case you find out eventually that your answer was wrong. In case you find that your thought process was wrong, your method was wrong, even if you kind of mistakenly land up on the right answer, you'd know when you listen to the solutions as to where you'd gone wrong. This is where you learn. Simply landing upon the right answer is not going to teach you so much, right? So pause the video, try spending as much time as you can, but not less than a minute, and then let's go ahead and solve the question together. So let us direct our attention to the passage. Now what you see here is something which is akin to an argument that is made by the columnist, okay? Now when you're looking for structure in an argument, it's a good starting point to identify as to what the conclusion is. This is a piece of text wherein identifying the conclusion is not very simple, because you do not see a word like thus, therefore, to conclude, clearly, or something like that, which very clearly indicates as to what the conclusion is. But still, you need to practice the exercise of being able to see the conclusion, because very often, even in the RC section, the reading comprehension section, you'll have questions that simply ask you as to what the main conclusion is. Okay, so let's see as to what this argument is about and what the conclusion is. When you can't find words such as thus and therefore, you're looking for where the opinion in the argument is, because then the opinion becomes the conclusion in most cases. Let's go through this and bear in mind that the point where you see the opinion is where you get the conclusion. Okay, it says, country X provides little funding for mental illnesses, even though such illnesses cost employers billions in employee absences. Okay, it says, but if mental health were guaranteed, costs would have to be contained by limiting treatment only to the most severe illnesses. So what you see here is that country X does not have much funding for mental illness, and it says that although such illnesses really cause loss to the employers, which basically means that there is no guarantee for mental health treatment, as you can see from the next line. It goes on to say, but if mental health care were guaranteed, costs would have to be limited to only those who are the most severely hurt. And then it says, Since experts rarely agree on who needs help the most. Okay. And then what you find here is between two commas. Okay. And I've told you this in many videos already, that what you see between two commas is an extra qualifier. It's making the sentence large. So what you can do is, for the time being, let me just black that out and then we'll add that back. You'd find that it's an easy way of reading and understanding long sentences. So let me just black out what you see between the two commas and read the sentence, and you'd find that the sentence becomes a lot easier. Now the sentence that we have is, since experts rarely agree on who needs help the most, guaranteeing treatment would illegitimately reduce benefits to the truly ill. Simple sentence. It says that, experts are not able to say who needs it the most. So maybe someone who is truly ill does not get it. Okay. Now let's add back what we removed. It says that, and often identify those who are not genuinely impaired as being mentally ill. Okay, so it says that they're not able to identify who needs it the most, and they also make wrong judgments, right? And then it says, moreover, let's go ahead, moreover, mental health experts disagree on the best course of treatment and on whether patients are cured. So identifying standard payments for particular illnesses would be problematic. Okay, so we have a plot here wherein we see that there's something about mental health care guarantee. You can see here that the columnist is basically telling you numerous problems about that. So where do you see the conclusion? Now when I look at these, I can see words such as problematic that indicate his opinion. Okay. You can also see words like illegitimately, right? These are words that reflect opinion. So what I can definitely say as of now is that the columnist doesn't appear to be someone who believes that there should be guarantee for mental health treatment. So the conclusion pretty much to me looks like the columnist saying that, hey, country X really cannot afford to have funding for mental illness. Okay, so he kind of justifies this particular position. Let's go ahead and see it in some more detail. So essentially the author is saying that, hey, when there's no funding, it does cause some loss. But if you were to guarantee it, there are so many complexities. And this is what makes up the bulk of what is given in here. So you can see that the opinion of the columnist basically points towards giving no guarantee. And this is pretty much what I would also identify as the conclusion of his argument, although you don't very clearly see it here. Now that we know what is spoken of in this column, let's go ahead and see as to which option concurs with our thought. Well, so the argument here is really simple. It says do not guarantee funding for mental illness because you are not in a position to find out as to who is deserving. You might end up giving this to people who are not completely deserving. Now that you've understood this, pause the video and try to see as to which of the options gives you what we just saw. Okay, so the answer is A. As you can see, it reads, country X should not guarantee funding of mental health care. You find the conclusion, and then it gives you the reason, because doing so would lower the level of care received by those who need it the most. Works pretty well. You can look at the other options and see as to why they're wrong. Let us move ahead. Right, so to some of us, this question could be a little worrisome, because as you can see, there's quite a bit of science going on in here. It talks about hormones, thyroxine, depletion, blah, 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 blood disease. Now, remember that the LSAT India does not test you on your knowledge of specific disciplines. If it's a science-based question, it's not so much about your knowledge of science as it is about your ability to just understand as to what is given here and then answer the question based on what is required of you. Never feel intimidated by the content or the length of a passage or the content or the length of options. Difficult looking things are actually very simple most of the time. Okay, with that confidence, pause the video, try solving the question yourself, and then we'll go for it together. Right, so let's read the passage together first, try to comprehend it, and then we'll go look at the options and see as to which one is the most supported by this to pick the right answer. Let's go for it. It reads, the recent outbreak of a rare blood disease is very worrisome largely because it is not known what causes it. Now I'd like to pause here for a moment. You see, it's very important for you to read actively. It's important for you to constantly engage, to be an active participant in this reading process. Simply looking at words as they come is really not going to help you. Now, when I read this first line, I could see something here, very worrisome. And this kind of points to me something very relevant for me in terms of understanding the structure of the argument. You can see here that when someone says something is worrisome, it reflects an opinion. Okay? And an opinion is important to me because this makes it very likely that this first line is the conclusion of the argument. Now, as I go ahead, I might find that the conclusion is probably not this. But even as of now, I am active. I'm looking for something. I'm objective here, which is why my reading process is not one of simply just taking a marker and just going ahead and reading these lines as they come. So what happens is when you don't do this, then you first take the marker and you read the whole thing, okay? And then you really haven't understood anything. So then you decide, hey, let's go look at the questions, the options. So you look at the question statement, you look at the options. That doesn't make too much sense to you. So you decide, hey, let's get back to this. This time you kind of try a new tempo. So you go really slow. So you like the recent outbreak of, that's not how it works. Teach yourself how to constantly stay active. Okay, let's move ahead. It says most researchers suspect that depletion of the hormone thyroxine in the brain contributes to contracting the disease. Okay, so it says here it is worrisome because you don't know what causes it. Okay, so there's a rare disease, you don't know how it is caused, and therefore it's worrisome. But then most researchers say that it happens because of something, which is that the depletion of the hormone thyroxine. You don't need to understand the science, but you can just see here that researchers suspect that there's a certain reason. It says that researchers suspect that depletion of the hormone thyroxine in the brain contributes to contracting the disease. Yet, the precise nature of the relationship between thyroxine depletion and the disease is difficult to discern at present. So they have a sort of suspicion, but they can't say with precision as to what is happening here, okay? So T depletion is basically thyroxine depletion. And then it goes on to say, it is important to note, however, that most people who suffer from even the most severe thyroxine depletion do not contract the disease. Okay, this is where it kind of gets maybe a little tricky for some of you. Remember that there are some things that are conditional statements. Let me give you an example. It's an example that's not very precise, but will kind of establish to you as to why this counterintuitive thing that you see here is actually right. Okay, so for example, let me talk about maybe chewing tobacco on the one hand, and then I talk about mouth cancer. Okay, so let us say researchers, as you can see here, researchers suspect that tobacco contributes to mouth cancer. Okay, maybe although the precise nature is not known, but still tobacco contributes to mouth cancer. That's what researchers suspect. The other thing that you might note, and as you might know from experience, that most of the people who consume tobacco do not have mouth cancer, who never contract mouth cancer. Okay, so as you can see, the relationship is kind of directional. Tobacco is seen as a cause or is seen to have a role in mouth cancer, but that doesn't mean that a large number of tobacco consumers have it. Okay, so one way of understanding this is that most people who have their thyroxine depleted do not have the disease. I just want you to understand the directionality of this condition. An example that I give you often is that, let's say, if it rains, then a peacock dances. But this does not mean that if the peacock dances, then it rains. It does not mean this, right? So there's a directionality of conditions that I just want to emphasize. Let us go ahead and try solving the question now. So let us look at what we have before us. We have a disease, the cause of which is not known. Okay. Then researchers suspect that, hey, the depletion of thyroxine contributes to the disease. You can also see that in most cases of depleted thyroxine, there is no disease. So on the basis of this, what can you infer? What can you anticipate? Spend some time, think about it. I'm going to tell you, but try doing it by yourself first. Okay, what you can see here is that thyroxine depletion does not appear to be the sole cause. It may contribute, but it may not be the sole cause of the disease, because if that was so, then people who had thyroxine depletion would have had the disease. So our final takeaway, our concise understanding of what this passage has to say is this, that thyroxine depletion alone does not cause, although it may contribute to contracting the disease, right? And now when you look at the options, which one do you think is the right answer? You can pause the video. Okay, so when you look at the option B, you can see that it concurs completely with what we anticipated. Let us move ahead.